My name is Jeremy Leggett. I'm an ex-geologist, used to be a creature of the oil industry, and I'm worried that there is a fundamental flaw built into the way we are running society. We've allowed ourselves to become fundamentally oil addicted, and everything depends on a growing supply of cheap oil for some decades at least into the future, until alternatives can be brought into place. I have come to believe that there's nowhere near as much oil out there in the world left to find, or in reserves that are supposedly proved, as we're being told by many oil companies and governments. People often don't realize just quite how dependent we've allowed ourselves to become on oil. It's much, much more than just the petrol that goes into your tank. 95% of all goods in shops depend on oil in some form or other. Agriculture, food production is particularly dependent on oil. For one cow to be grown, reared, fed and delivered to your plate, it takes 6 barrels of oil, and that's enough to drive a medium-sized car all the way across America. We're so addicted to oil that we're burning 85 million barrels a day at the moment and expecting to go up to 120 million barrels a day by 2020 or thereabouts. And there's nowhere near enough oil. The average size of oil field that's been discovered since the 1980s is just 50 million barrels, whereas in Saudi Arabia, the big fields will be well over 50 billion barrels. The industry has found all the elephants. All it's finding now is mice.
1 barrel of oil, the refined product of which 42 gallons of gasoline you can buy for a little over $100, will produce as much energy, as much work as you will get from 12 people working all year for you.
Take an average man performing physical labor for 25,000 hours to produce the amount of energy that's contained in that 1 barrel of oil. That barrel of oil, if it's pulled out of the ground in Iraq, can be pulled out of the ground for $1. You invest $1 and you get back 25,000 hours of human labor. That's an energy source that is so dense, it's essentially free energy.
It's all non-renewable, it's all extremely capital intensive, and it's probably the most invaluable natural resource we've ever discovered.
This is a transition that can't be done overnight. Hydrogen technology is being developed, but it is a 20-year program.
20 years?
Yeah, the next 20 years are an absolute critical point where I don't know that we can make it. I just feel we haven't started soon enough.
To get an alternative infrastructure after the crisis breaks.
Whether we reach the end of cheap oil in 3 years or 30, it will be a defining moment for human society. Even if there's only a 1 in 10 chance the early peakers are right. With the lifeblood of our economy at stake, shouldn't we listen, just in case?
If people like myself are taking the view that they need to speak out, I think it's time to start taking it seriously.
We have lots of preparedness for terrorist attacks, but where's the plan for peak oil? We don't have one.
I think the interesting thing about the problem is that we'll find out who's right really soon. Within a few years, it'll happen and play out on our watch.
We're headed to somewhere. Now, this isn't the only image. There's another one that was written by an Englishman who said, what will England look like? He said, well, it's going to be a bunch of little villages, each surrounded by a lot of forest that's used for firewood, and some much smaller garden plots, and a few pigs running around, and very strict birth control, because any increase in population is just a recipe for poverty. Then the next one, even worse, is a guy who says, look, we can't support 6 billion people. We haven't got enough food. The answer is cannibalism.
Eric Steinberg asked an extraordinary question at the Australian Petroleum Production and Exploration Association conference.
I asked them to put up their hands if they thought that we had reached peak oil. 50% of the people in the audience put up their hands saying that they believe we're at peak oil, and these are practicing petroleum industry professionals. I think it's happening now, frankly.
It gives me nightmares when I think about what we're headed for.
Just say again when we've peaked, when we're going to peak.
When we peaked, I think we peaked last year, globally.
And the maximum ever out of the earth will be?
The max, I think you're producing now 85 million barrels a day, and I think that's about all you'll ever be able to do.
How do you think business will react when this sinks in?
How business will react? I don't know. I think you'll take care of as production and 85 million barrels. You know, it's been predicted for a year now that the fourth quarter of this year would require 88 million barrels a day. And I said a year ago, I said the fourth quarter of 07 is going to get very interesting. If the prediction of 88 million, and you only have 85 million, the price has to go up.
We are making ourselves dependent on some extremely unstable regimes in some very nasty parts of the world.
Keeping the world dependence on oil as long as possible is important.
Not 1 in 50, not 1 in 100 of the people in our country have any inkling of the potential problem that we're facing.
Increased unemployment, poverty, bankruptcy, starvation. There are all kind of the things that happen when a society collapses.
So we enter an entirely new world of quite unbelievable dimensions, and yet it's only a few years away.
Everybody's assuming, all governments and all companies, all markets, but a growing body of us ex-geologists and current geologists who work in and around the oil industry who study this problem think it can't be done. That in actual fact the peak of production is really close. I believe it's 2008, plus or minus 2 years.
It could have been as early as mid-November and as late as January 6, 2006. But my line is, it's past, it's gone. My career as a prophet is over. I'm now a historian looking back at the peak.
My numbers actually say last year, but it could be this year. And if you consider all categories of oil, including the tar sands and the deep water and so on, I think 210 would be a good estimate. But really, it isn't, this peak has no great significance. It is the perception and the vision of the long decline that comes into sight on the other side of peak. That's really what matters.
Imagine for a moment a gigantic building full of oil. It's enormous, 1 kilometre on each side. Now look up. It towers a staggering 4.5 kilometres into the air. It's a tank of oil that would dwarf any city in the world. This is the volume of oil we burned in a single year, in 2004. 4.5 cubic kilometres of the stuff. Each year we guzzle another building like this, and each one climbs another 10 stories high.
At that point, the stock markets will crash in the way they did in October 1929. When the panic hits, some people will try and turn to coal, both for fuel and for the running of power plants, but that is not going to happen easily. That won't deconstruct the global energy crisis, and even eventually when we tee up with coal, we'll put so much greenhouse gas into the atmosphere if we go down that road that will fry the planet. This really isn't a viable option.
Somewhere ahead, one way or another, the end of the oil age is coming.
Our whole civilization has evolved in an era of stable climate, which is probably anomalous in terms of, if you look at it over geological time. So was this our moment in the sun, which is now coming to a close? You know, I mean, that's sort of a pessimistic view, but I think perhaps could be true.
Really and truly, you've got to be a flat earther not to see what's going on now and what's being projected by all the scientists studying climate. I mean, if we keep going as we are, we will wreck our economies and wreck our planet and really completely decimate ecosystems.
Well, I claim that our grandchildren are going to look at us and say, you burned all that oil, all those nice molecules, you just burned it? And we'll have to admit we just burned it.
Oil is a precious thing. Fossilized sunlight captured by tiny brainless organisms that lived for a mere instant in geological time. Yet every year we burn more and more of what we have less and less of.